Welcome to The Cutting Floor, a weekly podcast of West Cannon Baptist Church.
Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered John 7, verses 37 through 52. How does a biblical understanding of the theological significance of water help us to understand a passage like this?
When we think about water, we tend to think about it in 21st century Western terms. In other words, we don't have, most of us anyway, a real concern about access to water or the availability of water or the frequency of water. But if you're living in a largely agrarian society, or if your livelihood depends upon your flocks and herds having sufficient places to graze, then this question of access, reliability, abundance of water to the concern of your flocks and herds, to the concerns of your crops, your fruits, this is really important. The Feast of Tabernacles was celebrated after the ingathering of the harvest as a remembrance both of how God had provided for his people in the Exodus and God's continuing provision for his people. Bound up in that, of course, in the Exodus was the provision of water from a rock. The harvest is only possible if God continues to give his people water in the form of rain that will then nourish these crops and provide grazing for cattle. But if we read through the Old Testament carefully, we'll notice an emphasis that is placed on water as a source of God's blessing and the absence of water as a reflection of God's judgment. So if we think about going back even to the terms of the Mosaic covenant, the people's ability to live in the land and to experience the abundant water that would bring forth the fruit of the land was conditioned on on the people's covenant faithfulness to the requirements of God's law. If they failed to keep the covenant, then one of the consequences that they would experience would be the hardship of ground that was dry because of the lack of rain. And we see this multiple times throughout the Old Testament. So you have um, the prophet Elijah, who restricts rain on the nation during the reign of Ahab and Jezebel. You have also during the time of the judges when there's great wickedness going on, and we read of Ruth and her family, Naomi and her family, leaving the land of Israel where she meets Ruth the Moabitess, but they have to leave the land of Israel because there's a prolonged famine in the land. These are signs of God's judgment because of Israel's covenant unfaithfulness. So the Feast of Tabernacles, connected with this water ritual and the ingathering of the harvest, has this idea of obedience, covenant faithfulness, the blessing of God's provision of water. Well, who is Christ, who stands up and declares, if anyone is thirst, let them come to me and drink? He is the one who perfectly fulfills the law. He is the ultimate covenant keeper. He is the one who establishes the perfect obedience and righteousness of the law for his people, so that those who believe in him can receive his righteousness and therefore receive his covenant blessings and covenant rewards mediated through him. And so in that context, the one who gives living water, the blessing of God, is also the one who keeps the covenant, who keeps the terms of the covenant, and therefore secures the blessing of God for his people, and is able to then extend that blessing to others. So if we have a broader theology of a biblical foundation of what the significance of water is connected to the blessing or cursing around covenant faithfulness, we're going to appreciate not only the Feast of Booths, but also the work of Christ in a greater sense than perhaps if we only come to the text with our own feelings about how water and rain are really disconnected to any idea of covenant.
In your sermon, you noted that during the water ritual of the Feast of Tabernacles, the priest would pour out both water and wine before the altar, and you connected this to the piercing of Jesus. Are there any other connections that make the combination of water and wine significant?
One other text, there's a few other texts, but one other text in particular that I think is of interest here is in Genesis 49. Jacob, as he's about to die, brings all of his sons and he blesses each one of them. And of course, the most interesting of those blessings is the ones that's given to Judah, because Judah becomes the ultimate forerunner of the Christ. The Christ will come from Judah's family. And the blessing that Jacob bestows on Judah is fascinating because in that blessing, there's this conversation about the future day from someone in Judah's line when there will be immense blessing on the land. There's going to be peace from one's enemies. This forerunner of this future descendant of Judah will place his hand on the neck of his enemies. There's, I think, an allusion there to the Genesis 3:15. The seed of the woman will put his heel upon the head of the serpent. So there's connections there. But then at the end, there's this conversation about the abundance of this Messiah's reign that will come from Judah. It says, binding his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine, he has washed his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. This is what the future descendant of Judah will be like. And those connections with wine both have the context of blood and military victory, but they also have the idea of abundance, that this is a time when people are going to be feasting and rejoicing. And even that there's going to come a time when this coming one from Judah is going to bring in an era where wine is as abundant as water. He's going to wash his garments in wine. Well, what do we normally wash our garments? And we wash them in water because it's far more, one, cost effective to wash your garments in water. And then also there's questionable value in washing one's garments in wine. You're likely to get them more stained. But the point that the prophecy is making is that water and wine are going to be almost interchangeable because of the superabundance of this coming messianic reign. And so when we come forward then to this Feast of Tabernacles, this pouring out of the water and the wine, anticipating a coming day when God will bring the fulfillment of these promises of the dawning of this messianic age. And then Jesus, the one whose side is pierced and blood and water flows out, stands up in the middle of this feast and declares that he is the one who can offer living water for anyone who is thirsty. Come to me and drink. All of these images are coming together to identify Christ as that promised seed from Judah's line, that he is the one from whom the scepter will never depart. He is that one that Judah's greater son was always intended to draw our hearts to. This is the Christ who stands up in the Feast of Tabernacles on the great day of the feast.
In verse 52, the religious leaders say to Nicodemus that no prophet should ever come from Galilee to discredit Jesus. Is that true?
No, it isn't true. And this is one of the reminders that we shouldn't just assume that those who say things in the biblical text are right in what they are saying or even truthful in what they are saying. We should hold them up to the scrutiny of whether or not they're actually being true to the biblical witness. We know, for example, that Jonah is a prophet that came from Galilee. There's others that also came from the broader region of Galilee. In fact, one of the rabbinical schools had an expression that said that there has been a prophet from every tribe and house of Israel. In other words, there's no part of Israel that has been left unrepresented by a prophet at some point in Israel's history. And so in their attempt to discredit Jesus and also to discredit Nicodemus's impulse to judiciously evaluate the words and actions of Jesus, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, are just hyperbolizing and throwing out these ridiculous claims that just because in that moment a prophet from Galilee doesn't spring into their heads, or at least anyone of profound significance, perhaps nobody on the level of an Isaiah or a Nehemiah or an Ezekiel, they somehow neglect to really think through their history and realize that, number one, their own rabbis and religious leaders have asserted that there is no place in Israel that has not been represented by prophets. And if they were to think through it a little bit more, they could name some of these prophets like Jonah, who did in fact rise from Galilee. So we shouldn't take their outrage or their assertions at face value. They are speaking as men who are simply trying to discredit Jesus by any means possible and are willing to even circumvent the truth in order to do it. Their broader point, however, being that the great Messiah, the great prophet, is not in their expectation to come from Galilee, but we know that there's greater specificity about where Jesus is actually from that they are unaware of, that he is in fulfillment of the prophetic expectations of the house of David from the city of Bethlehem. And so despite all of their consternation, their hyperbolizing, their really dancing around and misrepresenting the truth, the religious leaders are revealing themselves to be of a temperament and deportment that should cause us to question the whole of their judgment as regards to Jesus. These are not men operating in good faith with a solid grasp of the truth. Rather, these are men who are really being fueled by their emotions and are throwing out accusations relatively blindly to facilitate a character assassination of Jesus that will simply be the precursor to their actual assassination of Jesus.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.